From The Australian, here's what's on the front. I'm Kristen Amiot. It's Friday, October 3, 2025. It's last drinks for a Sydney pub baron. Investors who poured millions of dollars into the public hospitality group are unlikely to recoup their cash after founder Jon Adgemis declared bankruptcy. And what about the boss? He'll never run a company again. That's today's episode. Friday night in Sydney. Workers shake off the week with a wine or a beer at one of the city's many beloved pubs. If you pulled up a chair at one of those pubs at some point in the past decade, there's a good chance it was owned by Jon Adgemis, the high-flying founder of the public hospitality group.
Jon is a kind of larger-than-life character. I mean, there's a kind of pantheon of publicans in this world. You've got Justin Hems, you've got the Laundies. I think Jon definitely aspired to be amongst them.
David Ross is a reporter with The Australian.
He's very much a man known for nice cars, hot girlfriends, nice watches. I spoke to a former colleague of his once who said that he was well known for being a bit of a figure on the dating circuit. You know, he's a kind of man about town. So the first story I wrote on Jon was a feature for the Australian's property section looking at Jon Adgemis. You know, he was this big new thing. He basically burst onto the scene during COVID when all of a sudden there were all these big deals being done to buy pubs. And there was basically one buyer, and that was Jon. Now, he snapped up the Norfolk Hotel, he snapped up the Manor House, the Oxford House. I mean, the biggest one of all was Noah's in Bondi. It was a huge sum that he put down on that. I really put his name on the map when he bought Noah's. We at The Australian wanted to get a sense of who was this man who was going around Sydney buying every pub he possibly could. And the first time I met him, you know, I literally walked in and we had a Palmer. It's quite a way to meet a publican, really.
But this week, the Adgemis empire came crashing down. As his venues were seized by administrators, Adgemis declared bankruptcy, saying he accepts responsibility for the historic collapse.
We know that Jon owes probably about $1.8 billion, which would make him amongst the most broke people in Australia at the moment. There is a little bit of room in that number. There's some suggestion that it's a kind of reflection of a bit of double counting by some of the lenders. You know, we can certainly say that he owes a hell of a lot more than most people.
The Australian Tax Office is circling too. In August, The Australian reported the ATO was investigating allegations of a potentially fraudulent GST scheme connected to Jon Adgemis's companies. That means he could be on the hook for a further $300 million.
Jon had a 95-foot yacht, the Halani, which was owned by Shirley Temple. He was living in the Bang & Olufsen house in Point Piper for quite some time, and then he's now recently moved to Bondi, where he's living in Will Vickers' penthouse apartment.
Adgemis's yacht has been sold and his mansions have been seized.
As we know, Jon had about $3.79 in his bank accounts. It's a little hard to imagine how all of these luxuries could be afforded given how little was in his accounts. The bankruptcy trustees for Jon have said that about $15 million was taken from the pub's business, some of which went to fund Jon's lifestyle, in addition to a wage that he paid himself out of that business. And in fact, we know that the rent on his Bondi pad was being paid for by one of the companies that Jon was a controller of. So it's quite clear that this luxury lifestyle was being funded through this pub's business and through this property enterprise.
So, David, how did this happen? What do you know about the way Jon Adgemis ran his businesses that allowed him to get in this deep?
You know, in days past, people borrowed money from banks and it was clearer who owed money to who. Jon's model was about borrowing money from private credit lenders. Archibald, Jemmy, Yorkway, Angus Securities. These are just some of the names that Jon owes money to. And quite often, these private credit lenders were being worked with, and Jon is not unique a lot in doing this alone. There are others who've done this, but you know, they were fast. They didn't ask too many questions. They didn't require too much documentation. And when it all came crashing down, it became quite clear that they had all lent on the same stuff and probably didn't realise that they had done this. A lot of the loans on these pubs were funded on a at complete valuation. That's where you're borrowing as though it's finished. but often it's not. The Vine in Collingwood in Melbourne is still a bomb site. The Saint was opened, it's now closed. Noah's in Bondi, it's never reopened since John bought it. There are so many on this list that were borrowed on an at-complete valuation that have never been completed.
For months, Jon Adgemis has been trying to stop these chickens from coming home to roost. At one point, his proposed solution relied on a cash top-up from his mum and sister, but it was rejected by lenders, and so he beat everyone to the punch by declaring bankruptcy.
John didn't want to be made bankrupt, because if you get made bankrupt, you end up driving a Nissan Micra and you can't leave the country. So what he did is he put up this thing called personal insolvency agreement. And it's basically a deal which says, if you don't make me bankrupt, I'll do this. And so John proposed that his mum and his sister would give him some money. And that money would be then distributed amongst his creditors, and they would get a 0.15 cents return in the dollar. It meant that he wouldn't have to give up his cars, but he would give up certain things, some artwork, the $3.79 in his bank account. But now that's all off the table because John has pulled the trigger on his own bankruptcy. The plan is over and it's all to play for. So bankruptcy can solve many problems, but it can't solve them all, one of which is an allegation of a fraud. I'm not suggesting that this is true, and obviously these things would have to be proved in court, but there appears to be some allegations of a very serious GST fraud that has happened in companies that John controlled or controls. By making himself bankrupt, these do not go away and they will remain to be investigated. Liquidators are investigating these companies. But people here are going to take an absolute bath. Like, it's looking from the current returns from the last set of reports, they're going to get 0.06 cents in the dollar return. So if you gave John $10, you get 0.6 cents. It's nothing. So these investors are going to get nothing. And they've all been burned. Whereas if this was a bank, the bank would wear the loss.
Coming up, Jon Adgemis' journey from deal maker to bankruptcy. Jon Adgemis' spectacular fall from financial grace puts him up there with some of the biggest bankruptcies in Australian history.
Former corporate high-flyer Alan Bond is once again a free man. He was originally jailed in 1997 for 4 years after being convicted of defrauding Bell Resources of more than $1 billion.
In business news, the chase for Christopher Skase's millions is unveiling some surprises.
Some of the best accounting minds in the country are now focusing on the web of companies that Skase set up to surround his Quintex operation.
At one point, Adgemis had dozens of properties and venues to his name.
It's a little difficult to establish, and I have kind of used the phrasing more than 22 venues. However, it has become clear that there were these other property things that John had picked up along the way and glued into this empire. There was a rooming house in Annandale. There was a block of flats in Paddington. There's a block of land out in Hurstville that he had plans to build a creche on. You know, at its peak, it was a very large business with quite a number of operating pubs, or pubs that were renovation projects or construction projects. You know, there were these kind of little bits and pieces of property that John had assembled along the way.
Adgemis got his start as a deal maker at KPMG, where he oversaw the floating of outdoor retailer Kathmandu on the stock market and the acquisition of Neil Perry's Rockpool Restaurant Group. He made the jump to property development later, but his plan to build a 60-storey tower on Sydney's lower North Shore also fell over. Undeterred, Adgemis gathered up his various venues and launched the Public Hospitality Group in the middle of a pandemic.
It is a brave thing to do to open a pubs business during COVID. Even after the pandemic ended, there were kind of restrictions on how many people could be in these places. The borders were closed. And this was not a gaming business. Most people do pubs to make money off poker machines, especially in New South Wales. The Public Hospitality Group model was not a gaming business. It was a drink, dine, and destination business. You stayed upstairs. You know, this was the kind of return to hotels as hotels under John. You know, he recreates all these hotel rooms upstairs in a lot of his venues, sets up new restaurants downstairs, puts more than just Tui's on tap. You know, that was the model.
David Ross is a business reporter with The Australian. You can read all his reporting about the end of the Adgemis empire right now at theaustralian.com.au.